The buyer showed up with a deed that said the house was his, and the county records agreed with him. Leonard Hayes stood on his front porch in Jacksonville, Florida, looking at the document the man was holding. It listed the address correctly, included a recorded deed number, and showed a transfer of ownership completed 6 weeks earlier. The buyer explained he had purchased the property from an investment company and was there to take possession. Leonard had never sold his house. He went inside, opened his laptop, and checked the county property records. The system showed the same thing the buyer's document did. Ownership had been transferred to a company called Atlantic Shore Holdings, LLC. The transfer had been recorded and finalized. The buyer's name appeared as the new owner following a subsequent sale. The system no longer listed Leonard as the owner. He went to the county clerk's office and requested the full record. The file showed a deed transferring the property from Leonard Hayes to Atlantic Shore Holdings, LLC. It included a notarized signature that resembled his own, along with identification details that matched public records. The document had been accepted and recorded without issue. That entry was enough to change ownership. Leonard contacted a real estate attorney and provided the documents. The attorney explained that the deed transfer was legally valid until proven fraudulent. Because the transfer had been recorded, the company had the authority to sell the property to another buyer. The second transaction had already taken place. 2 transfers had occurred without Leonard's involvement, and reversing both required proving the first one was fraudulent. The timeline showed how it happened. Several weeks before the deed was recorded, a change of mailing address had been filed for Leonard's property records. All official correspondence related to the transfer had been redirected. Leonard never received any notice of the deed filing, the ownership change, or the resale process. This prevented him from responding at any stage. At the same time, someone had gathered enough of his personal information to create convincing identification and signatures. The deed included details that matched public records, including his full name, property description, and ownership history. The signature resembled his handwriting closely enough to pass initial review. The notary listed on the document confirmed that identification had been presented at the time of notarization, but later admitted that proper verification procedures had not been followed. The identification used was accepted at face value. That allowed the document to be notarized and submitted for recording. Once the deed was recorded, Atlantic Shore Holdings, LLC became the legal owner in public records. That status allowed the company to list and sell the property. The buyer who arrived at Leonard's door completed a purchase based entirely on those records and believed the transaction was legitimate. Leonard's attorney filed an immediate legal challenge to the deed and the subsequent sale. A motion was submitted to place a hold on the property, preventing further action by the buyer while the case was reviewed. The court granted a temporary injunction stopping any transfer of possession. The situation now involved 3 parties with conflicting positions: Leonard as the original owner, the company as the recorded intermediary, and the buyer who had paid for the property. Each position depended on the validity of the recorded deed. The investigation focused on the origin of the deed and the identity used during the transaction. The company had been registered shortly before the transfer. It had no operational history, no physical location, and no verifiable business activity. The registration used minimal information and temporary contact details. Leonard reviewed his financial and credit records again. There was no loan, no mortgage, and no financial transaction tied to the property. The fraud did not involve borrowing or lending. It relied entirely on transferring ownership through documentation.
The mailing address change was traced to an in-person submission at a local records office. Surveillance footage showed an individual presenting identification and completing the request. That identification matched the one used during the notarization of the deed. This established a direct connection between the address change and the fraudulent transfer. The structure of the operation followed a repeatable pattern. Public records were used to identify properties with no mortgage. Personal information was collected to replicate identity. A deed was created and notarized using weak verification. The document was recorded, creating legal ownership. The property was then sold quickly before the original owner became aware. The buyer who purchased the property provided transaction details. The payment had been made through a wire transfer to an account associated with the company. That account had been opened shortly before the transaction and closed shortly after the funds were moved. The money had already passed through multiple accounts. The buyer relied on the county record to confirm ownership. The system showed a clean title under the company's name. There were no visible disputes at the time of purchase. From the buyer's perspective, the transaction followed standard procedure. Leonard's attorney expanded the case to include the second transaction. The argument focused on the dependency of the second sale on the validity of the first deed. If the first transfer was fraudulent, the second could not stand. The court required detailed evidence. Signature comparison showed measurable differences between Leonard's known signatures and the one on the deed. The identification used during notarization did not match official records when examined closely. The timeline of the mailing address change demonstrated intentional concealment. The notary's admission regarding insufficient verification weakened the credibility of the document further. The combination of these elements established that the deed was not authorized by Leonard. The court ruled that the deed transfer was fraudulent and void. That decision invalidated the company's ownership. Because the company never had legitimate ownership, it had no authority to sell the property. The second transaction was also declared invalid. Ownership of the property was restored to Leonard in county records. The buyer's claim shifted to recovering funds from the transaction rather than retaining ownership. The recorded entries were corrected to remove both transfers. The company ceased all activity shortly after the ruling. Its registration remained on file, but all associated communication channels were inactive. The individuals responsible were not immediately identified, and the funds had already been distributed through multiple accounts. Leonard implemented protective measures after the case concluded. He enrolled in property record alert systems, placed monitoring on his identity information, and ensured that any future changes to his property required direct confirmation. He also reviewed his records periodically to detect any unusual activity. The system that allowed the fraud relied on document acceptance at the point of submission. The deed was sufficient to transfer ownership. The recorded status was sufficient to enable a sale. The transaction was sufficient to move funds. Each stage operated independently, and each stage trusted the previous one. The buyer trusted the record. The county trusted the notarized document. The system trusted the process. All of it had started with a document Leonard never signed. And until that document was challenged and proven false, it was enough to make it appear that his house no longer belonged to him.